So let's change gears now.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Let's change gears now and talk about. It'll probably be a fast journey, but you come home. Obviously, you got married. You had some kids. Got divorced and had a faith crisis. So take us through some of that. That's a pretty epic story.
All right. So yeah, I got home from my mission. I jumped right into industrial design. I, just like my mission, was focused on excelling and just working as hard as possible. I knew that my parents were only able to commit to a certain bit of financial assistance, which was one semester. So for me, college wasn't so much about partying and exploring and any of those things. Plus, I was at BYU. But I just leaned really heavily into just working as hard as I could. I didn't have a lot of experience drawing before. I mean, I say drawing because drawing and the visual side of industrial design is a fairly strong component of what we do. It's not everything, but certainly as we capture ideas and communicate those ideas, being able to draw is important. So switching from a math major to industrial design, I just had to work really hard. I didn't have time to go to parties or events. I do remember just trying to date and meet people along the way, but it wasn't, I would say, a primary focus of mine in college. But I did graduate. Actually, I think my last 2 semesters, I essentially got paid to go to school because of my scholarships. And I was teaching as a student. I was teaching a transportation design class. Had a lot of great experiences. Got to go to San Francisco on an internship. I actually worked at GM as well on an internship. Great experiences. So graduated in 2007 with a job right out of college with a design studio in San Francisco. And so relocated there. And one of the people from my program at BYU, I also got him a job at the design firm I was at in San Francisco.
Okay, wait. So you emerged from BYU without having been married?
Yes. So I graduated.
Did you try?
Yes, I absolutely tried. I remember I was dating someone. We're still friends now. I was dating someone, and I did not want her to go on a mission because I wanted to get married. I was totally selfish about it, and we didn't end up dating through then. But that was probably the closest I got to any sort of meaningful, deep relationship, if you will. But in my youth, I was a bit impatient and probably bolstered a bit by. When you leave your mission, they give you a talk, or your mission president does, and he's like, okay, elders, you've had all these habits and good things that you've done. I want you to continue that as you transition into real life, and I want you to get married as quickly as possible. And so you see your former mission friends just getting married, and you start thinking, what's wrong with me? Why am I not having success? Part of that certainly is because I wasn't as social as I was able to be because I had to pay my way through school. But there's still that question of, okay, what am I lacking here? And so, I talked about before the cycle of indulging in things that in the context of Mormonism wouldn't fly. And yeah, I found myself back in those patterns because I felt less than. I felt like I was a disappointment. I wasn't able to just make that happen. So didn't graduate married. I felt really self-conscious about it. I remember transitioning into living in San Francisco. Granted, I'm 20. How old would I be? 24 at this time. Moved to San Francisco. I remember having the distinct thought.
People are you are being diplomatic or nondescript, and that's fine.
Okay.
But because people are tormented by different things, someone who's listening, we have Catholics and Jehovah's Witnesses who listen. They might interpret what you just said as like, what, were you on meth? Were you drinking? Were you on drugs? Like what? Are you just saying that sometimes you fell back into the law of chastity kind of stuff?
Yeah.
It made you feel unworthy, made you have a lot of self-doubt, the masturbation stuff, just to be explicit.
I am being diplomatic and
but only because it's a real journey that people have, right?
Yeah, I'd feel lonely and, not adequate or feel shame or guilt. And it was just a cycle of, just to feel good, I would eat or I'd masturbate. That was my life.
And you would feel... When you and I've talked to a lot of people like this, it's like, I can't date a girl because I'm not worthy.
Yeah. It's like,
so I'm not going to get into dating because I'm a bad person.
How am I going to get sealed ever? How am I going to climb out of this hole, so to speak? I mentioned the journals where I would just beat up on myself and essentially just hate myself for those things. And it wasn't a good place to be. Certainly. So yeah, I struggled with that. The food thing was interesting too, because I remember at one point, so I used to be, I'm not like a skinny guy right now, but I used to be 130 pounds or so heavier. And
heavier?
Yeah. I lost a lot of weight. And I remember a time in my life where I would just eat fast food, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then after dinner. But I was ashamed of it. There was a shame component because, my mom was concerned about, I lived at home for a little bit in Orem. My mom was concerned about me and I would stuff food wrappers under my bed, I remember. And at one point I just had a mountain of like food wrappers. I would get creative with hiding food or sneaking out at night to go, feel better because I was depressed. And I didn't even realize I was depressed. Depression wasn't a thing that I understood as a Jamaican. Like, you're not depressed. What is that? What is depression? Shake it off, And I can't say that I was medicating in my own way through food and other means, but I'm being diplomatic again. And turning the corner on that for me didn't happen till later in life, but it was certainly a crutch. It was certainly a comfort, a place that could take me away from my shame, even for a moment, to not feel like I'm going to hell. Because the overarching thought I had a lot of the time was, you're not doing it right. You're not enough. You're filthy, or just those dark, heavy feelings. So I would try to keep busy. I would eat. I would, look at porn from time to time, because it made me feel something that wasn't those feelings of guilt or shame.
And as you look back now, the depression, was it just those things? Was
Absolutely.
it just the food and the porn and the masturbation? Was it the skin color thing? Was it? It was
partly that. It was
or just the treadmill of perfectionism.
Yeah, it was a cycle of, not quite meeting my own expectations for myself and what I perceived to be others' expectations of me. And yeah, it's hard to talk about because those are personal dark times, really. I would say writing kept me alive. Friends, keeping it simple, focusing on family. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard to be single and graduate and again wonder, hey, what's wrong with me? I'm old. I'm 24. I'm old. Why haven't I made that connection yet?
Mm-hmm. So the writing that you did, what type of writing?
I was an obsessive journal writer, and I still write to this day, but not on a daily basis so much as a more event-based cadence. But it was daily, just journal writing, processing through events. Sometimes that meant beating up on myself because it felt like I should be punished or I should be unloved for a minute or whatever. But it was a good way to just record that. It's not the kind of writing I'd ever think would inspire my children necessarily. I remember thinking of journal writing as, hey, one day your kids will read this. I'm like, I don't want my kids to ever read this. But there were just a lot of feelings of self-loathing, if you will, that I recorded. And by keep me alive, I mean it kept me out of my head a bit more. More than had I just been indulging in food and distracting myself with porn or whatever. Like it was a better way, I felt, to deal with those feelings of guilt and shame.
I had a client tell me yesterday that alcohol saved her life. And what she meant by that is she was feeling so much stress and sadness that alcohol numbed that pain and got her got her through that period of suffering until she could find healing. But she actually attributed alcohol and this self-medication we do as saving her life. I had never thought of it that way.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that either. But and I can't say that for myself, certainly.
You're not going to say food and porn saved your life?
No, definitely not. I've since replaced that with exercise, but yeah.
At what age were you like your max weight?
I was 26, 27.
So that's a couple years in. Is that before your marriage or a couple years into your marriage?
That was actually about 6 months into my marriage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you moved to San Francisco.
So I moved to San Francisco, was working for the design firm of my dreams, a firm called Astro Studios. And just...
It's a top job, right?
Yeah, at the time they were... So if any of you have heard of the Xbox 360, they were the design firm that did that. They've done a lot of work for big brands. So I was able to work with, people from Microsoft or HP or Dell, just doing future... mostly consumer electronics products. Did work for Nike and Adidas as well. So it was a great experience.
Dream clients.
Yeah, dream clients. Yeah, I was working for real big companies. As a studio member of a studio, but yeah, it's really great work. It was a time when I was now living somewhere that was more diverse, which was interesting. Not quite as diverse as other places as you'd think, or not as you would think, but rather contrary to what you'd think. Not a ton of black people in almost said Salt Lake, San Francisco, but definitely more than Utah, and it felt more open and accepting. At the time, however, I was still somewhat conservative-minded, so being judgmental about people's lifestyles or choices
LGBT
was something. Yes, it was something that came with that conservative mindset. I didn't hate gay people, or I was there during Prop 8. So I remember being in the ward and being invited to go speak to neighbors or just all these outreach efforts, and it's kind of sinking in my pew seat and going, I'm not doing that. There's no way. It's not because of fright or the inability to speak to people, because I had since developed that on my mission. It was, I am not comfortable with this. This is not right. I didn't quite get to the point of anger about it, but I certainly did not want to be a part of that movement.
Right. Okay. So how did you end up? So talk. We probably won't get too much into your marriage and all that, but what do you want to say just about that?
So, as I mentioned before, my ex
had dumped you twice.
Dumped me twice on my mission. I jokingly tell people that it takes me 3 times to learn something, but the third time was she had reached out to me on Facebook, and at this point, like, that part or phase of my life had been so out of my the forefront of my mind that it took me a while to recognize her. I remember the reason I mentioned my friend from college being hired is we would sit next to each other. His name was John. And I go, John, you won't believe who contacted me. He's like, who? I'm like, my ex from my mission. She dared on me, because he had never met her or knew of her. And he's like, man, I'd stay away. And I jokingly tell him now, like, I wish I'd listened to you. But that being said, at the time I was happy. I was smitten. I felt like, hey, my person, this is great. You know, I'm finally turning the corner on this dream or goal. I'm old. I'm 26, but you know, I'm gonna get married and start a family, because a big part of Mormonism, I think, or a big component, is this idea of a plan. You know, you're on a path, and there are progressive steps to leveling up on that path, whether it be priesthood advancement or the young women's program, or it could be the fact that you've gone on a mission. So I feel like everything's spelled out. And so that part of my plan was missing. And that was really hard to reconcile. So I jumped at the opportunity, you know, reconnecting. I felt like, hey, this is going to be great, and just jumped right in. And we dated for a bit. She was actually divorced at the time. So her bishop didn't want her dating, right? So that didn't happen for a bit. But once we did, we got married, and I think it took us like 6 months to get married and figure that out. And it was a beautiful wedding, and lots of good.
What temple?
It was the Salt Lake Temple.
Okay.
Salt Lake Temple. We had the reception at the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. She's also a creative designer, and so we worked together. We were kind of this power team of creatives, where we'd bounce ideas off each other, or I would execute on something. So I hand-lettered all the invitations to her wedding, and she did all the place cards and decor at the wedding. So it was a good time. Unfortunately, at that time, however, thanks for pointing out Cecile on the stream, because it reminds me, at the time, 2 of my siblings had left the church and weren't able to attend the wedding. And that was hard. I mean, I admittedly, I didn't think a ton about it, because I felt justified in my Mormon righteousness, that I was doing what's right. Too bad for you. In fact, when I came off my mission, I was kind of a jerk to my one sister that, let's say, wasn't acting in line with the expectations of the church at the time. I've since apologized to her, but you know, I came home thinking, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get her back in the fold, and everything will be right. So that was something that I regret. Is something I regret and have apologized for. But yeah, it was a beautiful wedding. That was in 2009, and we were married for 7 years, just about, and had 2 children, 2 boys, and yeah, then we split.
And we've talked a little bit over sushi, and I remember you telling me how much you enjoyed, particularly, I think it's your time in Sacramento. Is that right? Like,
yeah. So
good church experiences.
Yeah, we wed in Utah. Lived in San Francisco, in the city, for little under a year, and then the Great Recession happened. And all of a sudden, all my coworkers started losing their jobs, getting laid off one by one. And it would happen in a way that people would get called into kind of this main conference room, and it was all glass. And you could just tell, okay, they're having that conversation. And pretty soon it was my turn and my best friend at the time, John. We got called in and we got laid off. Or I think it was furloughed technically, but excuse me, we're like, man, we live in San Francisco. Rent's high. He's married and has a kid. I'm married. It's like, we're not going to last very long here. So that day we walk out into the parking lot and decide to start a business. And like, where do we want to start it? Well, I have a house in Sacramento. Well, he did. And Sacramento, as far as the housing market goes, took a pounding, and was like, you could buy a house for half off. So we went to the temple, actually, and in the celestial room, we prayed about it and felt like, okay, this is the path we're going to take, both couples. And so we went and moved just outside Sacramento to a town called El Dorado Hills, is where we lived, and ran our business. And it was great. The church there felt very, very different than the church in San Francisco or even Utah, especially Utah. It felt more like home. And I say that because, as I mentioned, that feeling of love and peace and happiness, that was above all what I felt in that ward. There are people that we just fell in love with. It felt proactive. We weren't just a number or just the ward we were in San Francisco, for example. There were a lot of people that would move in and move out. And so I think people were actually investing in getting to know us, and that felt real. I met my other parents, I call them. It's family called the Davises there, and I just to this day just love them. They're great solid people. But that was a fantastic experience. It was also difficult, starting a business, 2 years out of school, not really knowing what we were doing. So had to do a lot of learning on the job, so to speak. Also learning how to be a husband and soon to be father at the time was also something that I had to do.
So we've got about 20-ish minutes before I have to wrap up. My daughter's graduating from high school today. So what can you tell us about the faith crisis?
Okay.
And
so
how that impacted the marriage?
We had, I'd mentioned the book I read on my mission, or at least the excerpt that I saw, and kind of pushing that off to the side, and my struggle with hearing that I was going to be resurrected white. So that had always, I thought I had put that to rest, but really it was just kind of lingering in the shadows, so to speak. Marriage, much like any other phase in life, you learn a lot and you learn a lot quickly. I would say for me, entering the marriage was based on a foundation of my faith at the time. With that, I mentioned the checklist. When you meet someone that's Mormon, did you go on a mission? Are you temple worthy? All that stuff. So I'd gone through the checklist in my head and felt like this is a good choice. So fast forward to, 2011 or so, we decided to leave California because most of our family was here in Utah at the time, and we would jokingly say the road to California is a one-way street because we weren't really feeling as connected with family. So made the decision at the time for business reasons, but also because of the family lack of connection to just relocate. So moved to Alpine, Utah, lived there for a bit while we were building what we thought of at the time as our dream house, and designed that, did a lot of work on it. All of that was happening at that time. And eventually finished that house, moved to Highland, Utah, just as Mormon as Alpine, Utah.
Super white, super
white.
Mormon.
Highland and Alpine are interesting because you have a lot of white families who adopt black kids. In fact, my friend Jeff, one of his kids is black, and so it felt good in a sense to be around more people that look like me, albeit in an unlikely setting or place. So I'm in Highland, and I wouldn't say we, at the time, at least I wasn't aware at the time that we were struggling in our sexual relationship, but my then wife at the time was like, "Hey, here's this podcast. It's really good. You should listen to it." I'm like, "Oh, okay, I'll listen to it." And it happened to be Jen Finlayson Fife on your
Mormon
podcast,
Stories?
Mormon Stories, yes. And so I'm listening. I'm like, "Oh, this is really good." And mind you, again, that thing's in the back of my head about race and the priesthood, and I'm listening about sexuality and, trying to be a better partner and husband. And then we make it through the whole series. We talk about it. I'm like, I want to hear more of this. I wonder what else is on this podcast. So I start listening, and I tried to listen to the ones that were more faith promoting, but eventually you make it through those. And I would listen as I was woodworking in our garage to build furniture or to build things for the house, just to pass time. And I listened to an episode, I believe it was Damon Smith, I believe, and if I'm getting the name wrong, my apologies. But the author of this book called The Book of Mammon, and he was talking about essentially the corporate nature of the church. I hadn't heard of Michael Quinn, for example, but he referenced his books there, and so I started digging in. I listened to episodes about Rock Waterman and Denver Snuffer, and this whole new world of thoughtful Mormonism was presented to me, and I was shifting from a place of, okay, sweep it under the rug, push it to the side, to more of a what if, open-minded approach to doctrine and the history of the church. Things didn't really come crashing down, however, until, and this probably sounds so common to so many, but November 2015, I'm teaching at BYU as an adjunct professor. The exclusion policy for the children of gay parents comes out. We were running our own businesses at the time, and so we would pay tithing on an annual basis. And just everything came into focus in that moment into a question: is this right? Is this a good thing? Because little by little, polygamy would come up, and my then wife would be dealing with that. The Rock Waterman episodes particularly were impactful for her, and that was kind of what set her on her path. She got to where I was in a week, and it took me about 18 months. So just that time frame, November through January, was really turbulent. It was really kind of an unraveling of that presumed foundation that we had as a couple, where, hey, this is what we do on Sundays, and this is how we are, and all of that just unraveled. So granted, that's not why we got divorced, but the faith crisis, if you will, had to do more with, do we support this organization that holds these views and is willing to exclude these people? And I think on some level it felt familiar because of what I had read, which was essentially an exclusion of me and my family going back as Black people from these blessings, these things that we aspired to. So it kind of rang true in that sense, and I felt anger. So my panic that I had on my mission now turned to anger, and I was upset and confused as to why God and His church would essentially punish children, as I saw it, for something their parents chose to do. That didn't make sense. You talk about Adam and or man not being punished for, or being punished for their own sins and not Adam's transgressions, right? That came into focus. I remember going on Facebook and ranting and just being really upset by the whole thing. But ultimately, we decided as a couple, hey, you know what? We're not going to cut that 5-figure check this year because we don't support this. And I remember looking at my then wife and asking, how do you feel about this? And we just kind of agreed we're not going to do it.
Can I just note, maybe it's obvious, I don't want to be glib, but it took the exclusion of a different group of people for the anger and the frustration to register, whereas when it was your own group of people, somehow that wasn't enough.
It was okay because it was explained to me in a way that made sense. The Levites, it's not our time yet.
And your parents are...
His ways are higher than our ways.
Right.
Yeah, they're believing I'm borrowing their light, leaning on their faith. So I hadn't really thought about that, but that is interesting. I think I was maybe prepped or conditioned or groomed to not see that as anything out of the ordinary. It was just, this is God and His ways aren't our ways. But it was really that policy. It was that policy. It was just realizing this doesn't make sense. I read about Quakers on the Moon, brushed it to the side. It wasn't upsetting. It was more funny. I then realized, wow, these are people speaking to God. They should know that this isn't the case, right? There should be some foresight. There should be some inspired outcomes. Prophecy's not happening or coming true. Remember having been an aspiring scholar on my mission and really leaning into the deep doctrines and mysteries, and then realizing, okay, this is conjecture, it's speculation, it's not really anything that's been fulfilled in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So, what do you do when you're of royal lineage, pioneer ancestry, your parents are devout, and a lot of your family's still in, some are out. You've given your whole life to this, your identity, everything. How did that proceed?
Yeah, once you make that choice to consider the possibility that everything you've been taught may not be true, once you open that door, it's really hard to not have questions and doubts just all of a sudden flood in. It's kind of a tidal wave, if you will, of all the small things that you brush to the side, all of a sudden just come roaring in like a tsunami, for lack of a better expression. But feeling and dealing with all of that at once it's overwhelming. And I remember I didn't ever feel comfortable asking my parents about any of it. I never did. I made that choice on my own. I didn't want to disappoint them, or part of it might have just been fear of having to wrestle and deal with the debate. At that point, I made up my mind that this isn't something I want to be a part of.
You didn't want the drama.
I didn't want the drama.
Was there a part of you that didn't want to mess with their faith, that you felt like their faith worked for them and you didn't
That came later.
Disrupt it? Oh,
that came later.
Okay.
So now I try to be very respectful of where they're at, and we don't debate, we don't argue. I've challenged them to find a place for us to develop a relationship outside of that, because for a while it was just very subtle things that they would say or do that alluded to their desire to have me come back. But to this day, we've never talked about it. As far as the question about lineage and the history that we kind of set up at the beginning and how that comes into play, when I did make it publicly known for a while, okay, so my racial identity as being Black, I was hypersensitive in Highland, Utah, of being the stereotypical deadbeat dad who stopped going to church. I would sit in church and rock back and forth in my bench because I'm having a mini panic attack at what I'm hearing over the pulpit or in a lesson. And I remember having a conversation with my ex at the time. She's like, oh, I just can't do this. And she's like, well, don't go. I'm like, it's not that simple, because I don't blend in, right? If I stop going, I am that deadbeat dad who abandoned his spouse and children, and I just did not want to be that guy. So for a while, I would just kind of work through my mini panic attacks and anxiety episodes, and just sit there and endure. So granted, I'm the ward chorister at the time. I'm in tears every Sunday leading to music, and people are thinking, man, he's having a spiritual experience, but it was really turbulent. So when I finally rounded the corner and came out publicly that, hey, I'm done with this, and I did make an announcement on Facebook, but that was in an effort to just get it out. And I did, and I got phone calls from friends in Jamaica. I got people reaching out, asking if I was okay. So there was that. But at that point, I had gotten to a place through therapy and through my own healing process. This is after I divorced. But I got to a place where I felt confident where I stood. And those conversations weren't terribly difficult. But there was certainly the sense that there was some disappointment, or at the very least surprise and concern because I had left.
What can you tell us about the marriage ending? Is there anything you want to say about that, or the?
At the time, it didn't make sense because
What didn't?
the split. As a Mormon, you're taught do what's right, things will work out, right? Two good people can make it work. So it was confusing and perplexing at the time, but since then,
Are you saying you didn't end it?
it wasn't something I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
No, it wasn't something I wanted. But now it makes sense. She's actually turns out she's lesbian and very happy, happily married and moving on, and that's awesome. It made a lot make sense for me, and I'm grateful for that. But as far as that experience goes, it helped me grow in a lot of important ways. Being able to own my own part, to improve my self-awareness, to grow up, if you will. I think that was a good outcome of that divorce. I'm a better father for it, certainly.
But that's a lot, to lose your faith completely, and then to lose your marriage, and then to be grappling with the reconstruction of an identity, all the feelings of trying to understand who you are now, what you've been through, all the conditioning, and then to have it all disappear.
Yeah.
And to do all that in Utah.
Yeah, that was certainly difficult. Just to give context as well, that happened within a 6-month time frame. All the unraveling. There was build up to that, as I was building the furniture and working in my garage and listening to podcasts and reading. But the complete, absolute unraveling of life happened within 6 months, and that was really tough. And it's one thing, like you said, to leave the church, another to get divorced, but all of it happening at once. So suddenly I find myself without a community, without a place. I'm still in this space where I'm thinking, I'm having conversations with a family member at this time, and I'm like, hey, it's about holding on to good and figuring out the middle path and staying active, when really I don't believe any of it. And ultimately we would discover that we had both chosen to leave. But community is something that I've struggled with since, certainly. There's a certain benefit that comes from being LDS. You can move anywhere, go to church on a Sunday, and you've got a lot of quote unquote friends instantly. And that's nice. It's comfortable, it's convenient, but it's not real. So my community has since shrunken, and I've had to find small pockets of people to associate with. We could probably talk for hours about being a single ex-Mormon in Utah specifically, but I will say it's not so easy to leave behind, at least here, the church socializes us to behave a certain way, and those behaviors sometimes are perpetuated outside of the church, even as you leave, culturally speaking. So that's been difficult. But yeah, my community's since been smaller. I love more deeply. I listen more. I try to. My sister might argue otherwise. She's one of my best friends now. I've found pockets of friends in other spaces as well. I've started to embrace, as I mentioned, my blackness more, and seek for opportunities to connect with people who have that perspective, or that understanding, if you will.
Yeah. So I'm just trying, I have no idea. I don't think many of us would have any idea what it would be like in your, 30s?
Yep, 30s.
To not know you're black, and then all of a sudden to learn you're black, but to learn you're black in a white Mormon context where it has got negative associations, and have to cope with that, stuff it all, put it in a box, and then realize that none of it was true. And then having to say, well, who am I then? Right? Do you just go back to being a human? And we should probably do a whole episode just on
I'm sure we
what
could,
it would
I'm
be
sure
to
we could
piece
get
your
some people
identity
together.
together.
I'm sure we could get some really interesting people and perspectives together for a chat like that. But it's almost like, you're going through the temple and you go from one place to the next and the lights turn on and you're like, whoa, hey, it's brighter in here. That's kind of what it feels like. Being able to just see things as they are. And as I've entered into this phase, as you put it, of embracing that blackness, it's not that I have to talk a certain way or act a certain way. That's on a superficial level. That's something, right? That we can use to identify with a certain group, but it's more about gaining an appreciation and understanding for the struggle, listening to people and their stories, sharing my stories with them, and feeling a part of something that's bigger than me. That's what's begun to give me identity. It's studying the history. It's understanding and realizing that things as they are, we're not always this way. There's a tendency, I think, in modern society or in a Christian context specifically, to just assume that things have always been that way. What was before Christianity? There's a question. What was my ancestral religion? What can I learn from that? Was it good? Because there's a tendency to think of things out of Africa as being bad or less than. So it's been a process of studying a bit, scratching the surface, digging deeper. Like I said, I'm still learning. There's so much to understand. You talk about being in my 30s. Yeah, I've got a lot of studying and learning and reading to do still. But it is difficult. I try not to shy away from my blackness anymore. It's what I get to make it out to be, certainly. And even just how I carry myself or thinking of myself as less than, I don't think of myself in the same way I used to when I was active, believing Mormon.
So as you think about, and again, this is something we talk about really a lot, but number one, what have you done with the anger? Because I imagine now that you look back and see the exclusion policy for African Americans, when you think about the teachings that prophets, seers, and revelators made about skin color and people of color, when you think about just the way people of color are treated and the way the scriptures talk about them, etc. I imagine this awakening could lead you to a place of still feeling very angry or frustrated or duped or deceived, that in some ways your identity was robbed from you and that you didn't even have a chance to form an identity. And then we compound upon that, probably you having been conservative, but then moving into a more progressive mindset, and you start thinking about Black Lives Matter and a lot of the issues around social justice with people of color today. That's kind of one whole branch I could imagine you pursuing, and seeing the types of movies that talk about driving while black and talk about the prison system and talking
13th.
about the movie 13th on
13th
Netflix.
is great.
Yeah, phenomenal stuff.
Eye-opening.
Yeah. But then there's also what you said just an hour or so ago, that like Mormonism fundamentally transformed your lives, your family's lives in very positive ways. I imagine that's some serious conflict.
Yeah, back to the beginning, I wouldn't exist if it weren't for Mormonism, literally. So in a sense, I'm grateful for that. As far as the anger goes, my anger was, I would say, short-lived. This is going to sound weird, maybe along the lines of your client, but I am grateful that I got divorced at the same time, as hard as it was, because it served as a a good emotional distraction from dwelling on the anger that I may have had at the time. I would say my anger turned to contempt, and then pity, and now compassion. So I try to seek to understand. I may not always agree with the opinions or points of view, beliefs of others, but I try to seek to understand now. But that anger, specifically with the exclusion policy, that was short-lived. I don't have or espouse feelings of anger right now because I've since had my name removed from the records, and that kind of helped. That was a symbolic move on my part, but it also, I think, mentally helped me separate myself from the body at large, knowing that I'm not counted among the numbers. And it just, for me anyways, and I'm not saying this is for everyone necessarily, but for me it was an important step in just creating some space and separation, which I think has helped me not necessarily feel as angry. If anything, I feel concern for people who are in. I do feel anger that maybe anger is the wrong word, but it's very disturbing, upsetting, sad that this organization does cause people to make choices to take their lives. That to me is just absolutely heartbreaking, and I can't imagine somewhat feeling like you're not enough and you as a human are just wrong. I didn't quite go through any sort of exclusion myself, but for example, people that are gay that are excluded from being married and recognized I'm not sure. There's so many changes now. I haven't taken my vitamins today, but they're just, I can't necessarily relate to that, but I do understand the feeling of, hey, I'm fundamentally unacceptable to God. And that is hard. It's a hard feeling to grapple with, and to reconcile.
And yet you experienced that for so long yourself. And it took, like we talked about, your empathies with the LGBT community to sort of then allow yourself to feel the same way, right?
Yeah, a good analogy might be, we're on this journey, I'm in this car, we're on this path, and the exclusion policy for me was like being T-boned. It was something that was adjacent to my own experience, but I think it helped bring into focus what I had read before. In fact, at the time I was transitioning out of the church or questioning, I bought that book, The Church and the Negro. I bought a copy. It was so upsetting that I threw it in the trash immediately. And several months later, or maybe it was a year or so later, I actually bought another copy, and I still have that copy, just as a reminder of that moment for me and, what was actually said.
Yeah. And so you don't have a copy now?
I do have a copy now.
Okay.
I do have a copy. I have that. And I have another book called Mormonism and the Negro. So I've since expanded my collection, but I think those things shouldn't be buried. I think they shouldn't be just swept under the rug, because the way you talk about or asked about my experience with conference growing up, these are prophets, seers, and revelators who speak with God, who are saying these things, and it's important that we remember what was said. So for me, it's not a means of holding on to the anger, just, hey, this is how this organization thought of my people.
Yeah. Did the reversal of the exclusion policy make you feel better? Change anything?
That's a good question. I remember where I was. I was just at work with some friends, and my phone starts blowing up, and I jokingly would tell people, well, I'm not going to baptize my oldest because his mom's gay, so it was a nice out. So when that happened, I was kind of like, okay, now I've got to actually just be like, no, I'm not going to baptize my kid. But I do remember when it happened, and for me, it didn't make anything better per se, because, and I feel this way about race in the church as well. Culture is really difficult to move. If you will, policy changes are like a tugboat trying to right an ocean liner that's moving in the ocean. It takes time. The civil rights movement, we still have racism in this country, certainly. To deny that is absurd. I would argue that within the church even, these are things that were practiced forever. Well, not forever, for a significant amount of time. And I'm not convinced that with a policy change, there will be a cultural shift that is meaningful until a generation has passed. So while I'm excited for the prospect of it, I'm also sad of what that means, rather. I'm also sad for the people who are still in the church, that are living in that context. Even though the policy has changed, the culture may not catch up to that soon enough.
What's it like having your parents still in and some of your siblings still in?
It's interesting. We're divided on spiritual, religious lines, but also politically divided as well. So that leads to some interesting interactions and commentary where, I'm accepting of things they may not be accepting of. But as I mentioned before, we don't really talk religion. It's hard because part of me does wish they would come join me in the light side, as I call it. But I did have an experience with my parents once, or specifically my mom. I just said, look, 4 of us, we're not coming back. That's just not happening. So we need to find a way to build a relationship. And since then, I've been able to see a different side of my parents, to their credit. They have been more open and accepting, loving, and I don't feel as criticized as I used to. Maybe that's just myself coming into my own place of comfort. My mom, she'll still tell me she's praying for me, or puts my name on the rolls of the temple, that kind of thing. But there's no longer a pressure to feel like, hey, you need to come back. But it's shifted a bit to more acceptance. That's specifically with my parents. I've never had a super tight relationship with my oldest sibling, and that's somewhat a factor of just the age gap. When I was born, they were 19. So, we've had to get to know each other later in life. They are what you would consider to be an apologist. And, we've had specifically another sibling and my oldest have had conversations, and it's very much apologetic in his approach to defending the church, which is somewhat frustrating because the other part of this story is, as Nugents, we value education, we value mindfulness and just being sharp. And so it's frustrating on a level to see this sibling kind of step away from that and excuse themselves out of logical presentations of facts, for example. So those are some of the struggles we have, but I would say things are a lot better now than they probably were closer to when I was divorced and leaving the church.
There's a whole conversation we could have about being a single black ex-Mormon man divorced in Utah, and how you navigate morality and dating, and we'll probably have to cover that another time. But I am curious where you've landed, if you're comfortable sharing with just beliefs, You still have spiritual or religious beliefs?
As far as I know, John, we're living in a computer simulation. I'm just kidding. I don't know. I would say I try not to focus on that. My belief, actually David Bokovoy said it better than I could ever. My religion is love, or love is my religion. Bob Marley said essentially the same thing. It's not so much that I believe that there is a corporeal being in the heavens that's concerned with whether or not you're masturbating or looking at porn. I believe that fundamentally, humanity, we're the result of people before us doing better than the people before them, and that's what I try to do, is treat people better, be better, learn from my mistakes, own them. I'm not perfect. I've made plenty of mistakes in this turbulent exit from the church, certainly, but I try to learn from those experiences and be better. So if I were to assign a label to myself, I would say I'm a hopeful agnostic. I hope there's more to this, but if there's not, I hope to come to a place where I'm at peace with one day the lights going out and all that's left is the things I've done to help others, because it's been somewhat of a challenging thought given what you're taught about forever families and all that, and challenging that notion and being open to the idea of what if this is all there is? How does that change my day-to-day interactions? And I think about that a lot. But what if the lights go out and there's no more? I have to be okay with that. But I hope there is more to this. I don't expect that there will be some being on the other side that's waiting for me to shake their hand or wave at them in a certain way and let me in to wherever I'm going. But I do hope that the connections I make in this life are meaningful in the long run.
Maybe to close, I imagine you have had to fight with feelings of guilt or shame that your parents were pioneers into Mormonism and now you're leaving it. Although when I think about Carolyn Pearson's poem about pioneers, every era kind of has its pioneers. So I wonder how you've dealt with the potential guilt or shame of making a very different direction than your parents did when they came from such a position of status and of courage and of pioneering spirit, etc. And then I don't want to answer that question for you, but I wonder if you think of yourself as a pioneer too.
I actually had that thought as you were asking the question, but as far as the guilt or shame, that's largely subsided. I did grapple with feelings of disappointment because I've carried that my whole life. I've carried that story. I've identified by that story. I've lived on their board light. I've loved their story. Like it's really cool. So we've never had a direct conversation about it. My parents and I. The feelings of their actions being meant as an expression of disappointment have largely subsided since. So I feel like I've come to terms with that exit, that departure. I no longer feel like my choices are, well, let me say it this way. I feel like on some level they're likely disappointing. My choices are likely disappointing to them. However, it no longer matters to me, because what matters is how I live my life, and what I'm doing for my boys to teach them to be better than I am. Because, like I mentioned, just being absent because of church, I don't have the best relationship with my dad, for example. So trying to be present. And sometimes, honestly, I catch myself, it may not be church, but I find myself absent because of work or other things. And I have to catch myself and, hey, you know what? Tonight, guys, we're going to watch a Lego movie and we're just going to hang out and chill. So little things like that. But as far as the disappointment goes, I feel like I'm in a place where I can and have managed that. I haven't had the thought or process through thinking, hey, you're kind of a pioneer, but I do feel like I am charting a different path for my kids. It's completely terrifying at times because I don't have an instruction manual for this. I no longer have a plan. I don't know what's next. I'm interested in making sure that they are better than I was, that they don't feel guilt and shame. We've already had light sex talks, body image positivity. My body as a grown man who used to be overweight is a little different than theirs. And, I try to let them know, hey, that's okay. People come in different shapes and sizes, just things like that. So my goal is to be a pioneer in that regard, with my family and my responsibility.
It's beautiful. Last question. I don't know if there's any chance that any Jamaicans will ever watch this interview. If there's a Jamaican watching this interview that's like, oh, I didn't know any of this stuff, or they're feeling compelled by your story, do you have any advice for any of them?
My advice, and this goes beyond Jamaicans, but if you are listening to this or watching, and I've said something that makes you go, whoa, I had no idea about this or that. I think the best thing you can do is be willing to consider the possibility, not accept that it's so, but consider the possibility that what you've been taught may not be completely true or for you. Be open, be willing to question, ask why, and don't settle for answers that seek to hand wave away your doubt or anxiety. Consider the source. Always consider the source of the information you're receiving, but also be open-minded. And just know that there are real answers out there.
Beautiful. Well, I think one of our listeners, Kelly, said it best. She writes, Spencer, you are a beautiful human. Thank you so much for your heartfelt story, honesty, and sincerity. Very much enjoying listening to you. And on behalf of all our listeners, Spencer Nugent, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful, amazing, courageous, epic story on Mormon Stories Podcast. And I can't wait to see how your talents and abilities get expressed in the years and decades ahead, because I think you're doing and will do many great things, and I can't wait to follow what happens next.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, John.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today on Mormon Stories Podcast. It's been great. Email us at mormonstories@gmail.com. If you want to support us financially, go to mormonstories.org, hit the PayPal button, and become a monthly donor. 10, 15, 20, 50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. Keeps the lights on, helps us pay for all that we pay for, and helps us bring this programming to you. We really appreciate it. Thanks to Jeff for your production support. It's been great. And Spencer, again, you're awesome. Thanks so much. Take care.